Hello, everyone, and welcome to 368.tv. My name's Chooks, and with me in the house again is Barnaby Fox from Pako Creative, who's going to be exploring learning strategies in today's episode. Hello, Barnaby.
Good afternoon, chicks. How you
I'm
doing?
very well. Really good to see you after your short break. I'm sure you're well rested, refreshed, and you can tackle the burning questions for today.
Hopefully, I'll look the part after being well rested.
Yeah. All right. Basically, if anyone who is watching this, you probably would have seen our last episode with Barnaby looking at learning ecosystems. So this is like a sequel to it. Today we're exploring learning strategies. And my first question is more of a personal nature. What learning strategies have proven for you to be most effective in acquiring new skills and knowledge?
Yeah, I think that's, I suppose, when we talk about learning and development, how do we flip it round, perhaps from, say, a company objective to give individuals skills and whatnot, is to turn that around and go, how do I acquire those skills and how do I get that? So for me, I think the way that I look at that, and I suppose if I was to try and put a strategy to it, would be I look at something called the formula of change, which I think drives most things. And I suppose learning and gaining information and wanting to improve yourself is exactly that, is a change. And I think most things in my life where I've got to a stage where I thought I've really got to acquire more skills or become better at X, Y, Z is I've had a real dissatisfaction. I thought I'm not good at this, or I need to do this to get to this. And there's almost like a bit of gut wrenching feeling there going, there is a dissatisfaction. So I think that's the main thing. And when we look at the formula of change, is really what you're looking at is this idea of having that dissatisfaction and then accompanied by a vision. So what do you want that to look like? So in simple terms, I want to become a really good soccer player by the end of the year. That's probably Harry unlikely at my age, but still I want to become better than what I am. So what does that look like? Does it look like me scoring a goal at Wembley in the FA Cup final? Probably not, but it might be running rings around my friends on the five-a-side park. So that's the vision I've got for doing it. And then, like most things in life, we don't just jump straight to the end result and we don't just get it straight away. We then have to work back and go, okay, what are those steps? And so really it's this idea of what's the first step you might be able to take to be able to get to that vision and overcome that dissatisfaction. And really most people don't put off by perhaps acquiring new skills, and because there's a resistance, there's a fear. And the idea around the formula of change is that with that dissatisfaction, that vision and that first step, you can then overcome that resistance. And hopefully, certainly in my world, it's helped me, I guess, acquire new skills and help me on my own personal learning journey, whatever that might be.
Good. Dissatisfaction, the need for change, and vision. I think those are the two things. I still believe you can still be a great soccer player, so go for it if you need to.
Thanks. Yeah, my brain might say that, but my body might disagree, I'm afraid.
Fair enough. One thing I failed to mention is I wanted you to introduce Pako Creative, and I think it's a really good segue into the second question. So maybe before you get into the question, give us a little bit about what Pako Creative is about and what your focus is. Then about today's topic, which is about learning strategies. How does your organization incorporate varied learning strategies to accommodate different learning preferences and different styles?
Yeah, look, I think Pako Creative really did come from that need for me as just a dissatisfaction of potentially, I suppose, working within quite constrained, I suppose, frameworks and predetermined models, perhaps that you go into when you maybe work somewhere full time or you plug into a bigger system apart from yourself. I think ultimately we all want to work in an environment where we feel that we're making an impact. And really the idea as to why I started Pako Creative was, I suppose, the journey that I took is that I suppose I never woke up and thought, this is what I want to do. And I really envy people who can do that. I was never someone who could do that. So I think what you do figure out is you might go, I don't know what I want to do, but then along the way you figure out what you don't want to do. And I think what I learned was that I'm quite good at going in and having quite an early impact. I'm quite good at simplifying things. I'm dyslexic, and I think all dyslexic people have this wonderful way that they can compartmentalize lots of moving parts and almost come up with a solution and present that back when perhaps people are a little bit in the sort of trying to define the wood from the tree. So really Pako Creative is an idea of how I can bring together my passion for learning and development along with content creation. I think very much they're hand in hand now. So it's really a three-pronged attack. Is you have the strategy side of that, which we talked about last time. So we talk about what does learning look like and how would that work in any given organization. Then we have the content part is how do we bring that content to life? And that can veer off into kind of very short, sharp snippets, but we've gone on and made feature length films, for example. So we try not to constrain ourselves with that. And then ultimately it's that delivery and then setting up possibly for once we've done it, how do we hand that over to ensure that continues on? And I think when you work in that, I suppose that consulting way is actually the best satisfaction I get is when we go back and work with clients, say that we picked up 10 years ago and they're still using those systems. Pako Creative for me is a very small, nimble consultancy agency that really listens to what the crux of the problems are and offers solutions to fit people's needs.
Excellent. I think that's actually really poignant thing for businesses to do is listen to what the needs are, then create solutions that fit the need, not the process of retrofitting a product to fit a need or where we start making workarounds and let's see how this fits into this box. So with everything you're doing with Pako Creative and in the L&D space, can you share an example of a successful learning strategy implementation that resulted in improved knowledge retention or skill development? We know that most organizations would have a myriad of, I'll call them professional development courses. But the question is, are people really learning or are they just ticking it off a checklist because my manager says I have to do X, Y, Z today? So the question here is around what are some successful learning strategies that you've implemented and maybe that has resulted in people retaining that knowledge or skill development?
Yeah, it's a really good question and a relevant one. And I think the point that you've made there is unfortunately, we live in this slightly predetermined premise of the organization is making me do this. And that's, I think, when you're off to that mark or to that start, which we've all been through, is quite a hard thing to overcome. So I suppose let me think back to a time when I worked in manufacturing. I was working for a manufacturing company back in the UK and really being brought on to look and see how we expanded ultimately our production line. And the chap I was working for at the time said to me, look, we're not going to increase the hours. We can't effectively bolt on 4 hours at the end of a shift, for example, and make more product. We can't increase our foot space within the facility. And in fact, we need to probably lose a couple of stations along the way because we need to look and see how we build this product in a much more efficient way. And ultimately, we need to scale this up. And what I learned quite quickly, and I think I talked about this last time, was we talked last time about, I suppose, managing up. And then you think, how do you manage down and how do you get individuals who are effectively doing the work, who are maybe in this scenario hands on? How do you get those individuals involved and how do you get those individuals to buy in and feel a part of that process? What we did in this situation is that we had a very organic production line that had grown up with the business and didn't necessarily have any sort of engineering kudos or strategy behind that itself. And what I realized quite quickly is that it wasn't necessarily the engineers who technically figure out how to do things quite quickly and proficiently, and they could run it through a system that would say, this is the best way of doing it. Actually, it was about working back with those individuals who did it every day. So in the case of this is when we built a bay, for example, to when we assembled things, if we needed a P9 bolt there and a P9 nut there, actually that's the stuff we need to figure out. So someone's going from there to there as opposed to picking something up and then going to the bottom right hand corner to pick individual items up. So what that taught me is when you're going through this project planning and change, these stages, what you're trying to do is you're trying to bring everybody on board on the conversation so no one's feeling dejected. And sometimes it's quite good to over egg that and ask lots and lots of different questions. And what we had in that scenario then is we realized that actually we had to make this change really quickly. We could only shut the production line down for 48 hours over a weekend. We had 80 staff at the time. And there was no way that I could go out and train all those staff individually. What we did is we went and found who are our top performers on that line and who wanted a little bit more responsibility. So as part of that project, we say, okay, not only are we changing a production line, let's level up the maturity of the individuals on that, or some of the individuals on that line and give them more responsibility. So ultimately, you delegate out, and I have to admit, I think they call it management by absenteeism. Perhaps is the phrase where you say, "This is what I want you to do. I trust you to go and execute that." And I think that's vital when you are delivering any project or change or strategy. is you've got to trust the people around you to go forth and do that. And you can't get into this micromanaging mode. It really doesn't work particularly well. So they went off and they owned their sections. We had a production line of, say, 24 stations building a product. We then say we take those 24 stations and then we let's put them down into 3 stations of 8 or
Mm,
something. And then we delegate that leadership out. And then they're taking ownership of that. But meanwhile, we're still playing to our goal in this scenario. And what we managed to do there by, I suppose, being quite coordinated and using what skills we had at the time, is we really latched onto that and pulled all that knowledge together in a really cohesive way. And I think this is, in my experience, this is where a lot of organizations fail, is they have the knowledge, but they don't have that middle person to sometimes translate. And I think that's where learning and development
mm,
sits, if I'm being honest with you, is I remember someone summed up to me once, they said, "Oh, we've got nuggets, we've got gold nuggets in this business. We just can't crack them open and create the jewelry, as it were." And I think that was a great example, this particular project that we did, of where we took, I think we were producing something like 27,000 items a year, and that went to 50,000, but then they could duplicate the production line. So then that ultimately went to 100,000 products a year. So real change to that particular business by a very calculated change, but actually the implementation process was less than 48 hours. So quite transformational for that particular business. But I'm forever talk when I talk to people across organizations, they're forever saying that to me. And I think I once read a job description and the description said must be able to translate into layman's terms. And I've always kept that with me. I've always thought, yeah, if you could summarize in a sentence perhaps what learning and development is about, it sometimes is that translation part of into layman's terms so we can all benefit from the
mm. But
knowledge.
I will also argue that not all learning and development experts understand that as a trade. I struggled with it a lot. Most
Do you?
from
Okay.
high polluting to think more about the person who's receiving the content you're developing. But it's a skill to develop over time. I think
Yep.
that there's a level of knowledge management, which you mentioned there, is being able to find the pockets of information across the organization and bringing together in that cohesive structure you mentioned there. Last time we talked about learning ecosystems and learning environments. So I'm not going to touch on the technology for this instance. I'm going to look at how do you adapt your learning strategies when faced with new and challenging subject matter? Because one of the things I would say a learning designer can do exceptionally well is move from a science to an art to, because we know there's some level of creativity we're going to attract. We're going to learn something on the journey as well. And it gives us that level of ability to think and understand different subject matters. So how do you do that in terms of adapting? And what advice would you give others seeking effective learning approaches?
First of all, I think when you're working on any particular project, I suppose the subject and what your goals are have got to be quite clearly defined from the off. And I think what I always do is whenever I take on any certainly content projects is we actually have like almost a contract at the beginning of it. It's almost like a spin-off of a learning needs analysis from this. This is what we're going to create. And these are the items you're going to get at the end of it. And this is how it's going to be done. And this is what the process looks like. Now, that's almost like the horrible kind of contracty stuff that you're just setting expectations very early on. Now, I think what you've brought up perhaps also involves personalities as well. So that does happen quite often is you'll start a project and, for example, you might be with one SME and then all of a sudden you're onto your second or third one just because of the nature of the environment you're working in. And I think for me, a lot of these things boil down to ego
But
and the ability to sometimes remove yourself and your ego from said things. Now, if someone wants to go about something in a different way, I want to have typefaces, or and then that's really simple. But honestly, the conversations I've been in where people don't like the typeface on something, or they don't like the image, is you're like, okay, really, are we gonna really hammer this out? Is that gonna have a great effect on the final product? No, probably not. So why do I need to have that individual battle? So it can boil down to the simplicity of that, or it can just really boil down to maybe there's just a little bit of who's who in the zoo and who's going to be at the top of that. So there's a little bit there of being able to say, okay, what were my goals? The journey is slightly changing, the path is slightly changing now, but the goal really shouldn't be changing. If your goals have changed and you're coming out with a totally different product, then you've missed the mark and you've been led. So as long as you're continuing to focus on that desired outcome, the journey in the middle is about that people relationship, about that management, about understanding that things change. And I learned quite a couple of years ago, I worked with a fantastic project manager who I was always someone who would go, oh, if there's a problem, then let's find out what the problem was and how did we get there. And he was like, what's the point? Yeah, we can do a big debrief at the end of it and we can pick up our learns. But while you're in it, you might as well just focus your efforts on actually getting the job done. So I think when you have any aspects of ambiguity, and I think when we talk about skills within this industry, I think dealing with ambiguity is right up there. I'd say it was one of the top 5 skills to have as someone who works in learning and development. The ability to deal with things that come across your desk and be able to react to them whilst not being swayed. Because usually in these situations, you take on a project, it's signed up at a very high level, and then you're maybe working with individuals at your level. So ultimately, the people that are paying the bills are not saying to you, how are you going to get there? You guys need to go away and figure it out. That's what we're paying you to do. They're interested in the end result. For me, the advice I would give to anybody is one, remove your ego. We all have one, and sometimes it's really good to use it, and other times it's actually quite good to step back because it just means that you're not going head to head with people. Perhaps really bring in and just be able to iterate what you're trying to achieve in a number of different ways. And if it doesn't work the first time, keep going at it. I used to work with someone who just hated sitting in meeting rooms and didn't like the environment. So we would go for a walk around the park to discuss something. You've got to figure these things out a little bit and have some tools in your arsenal when it comes to an emotional intelligence stance to be able to come up with those solutions. Ultimately, as a consultant or someone being brought into a business, that's what they're paying you to do.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that needs to deal with a very large number of ambiguities is very important because most times you probably don't even know what you need to do at the very first time. Then you need to walk through it. But I think one of the things we L&D professionals enjoy is having frameworks to lean on to give you the first structure, then do the back and forth with the subject matter experts. Yeah, to make sure a sense check that things are going in the right way. The need for prototypes and that reiteration or iteration rather. We're gonna end today's episode on a very light note. And you've been talking about goals, the need for goals. So, what methods do you use to set meaningful goals that align with both your personal aspirations and your personal values? And I'll tell you why I asked this question at the end.
So I think for me personally, when I set, I suppose, what my personal and professional goals are, is I always ask myself, like, where do I want to be in 5 years' time? That's really cliche, isn't it? Like, you always get asked that by your manager or whatnot. Where do you want to be in 5 years' time? And someone said it to me, what you're doing, will that get you to that? So I suppose, what are those first steps that you're taking to get to that? And I think Sam Neill, the actor, summed it up wonderfully in an interview once when he was talking about his troubles when he was trying to break out as an actor and didn't get his break until his 40s. He said, acting is what I do, it's not who I am. And I think that's really key. And I think we touched on this last time, this idea that sometimes if you lose an element of your professional life, it has an impact on your personal life. So I think for me is when I realize that there's probably going to be 30% of a little bit of ambiguity around where I'm going to be in 5 years' time. I'm really not too sure. Seriously, all I am is I'm enjoying the journey. And I think there's the other thing is you have two different types of people, perhaps, is you have those who seek the destination and then you have those who seek the
Right.
journey. I think I'm a journeyman and I quite like that. And I think I'm quite content with that. And it almost feels like sometimes when admitting to these things, you go, "Oh, okay, that's quite light for me." So I think I know I'm a journeyman, but I also know I do want to. I think I'd like to work with certain brands, and I'd like to work in certain industries. And then personally, I'd like to do. I have my goals of I'd like to walk the GR5 route, for example, from Lake Geneva to Nice. So you've got those short, medium, and long
Yeah.
term goals that you always have. And for me personally, I like to write them down. Go, okay, might not do that walk this year, but I might be able to do it in 5 years' time. But what walks am I going to do to get there and be ready for that? Really, probably not the answer you wanted because it's not so constrained. But I think For me personally, it's a case of writing that down in a really simple list and then understanding the nuances along the way and going, well, and really almost forgiving yourself and not worrying about it if you don't get there. But as long as you're still enjoying it, really, I think that's what life is all about.
Yeah, there's actually no right or wrong answer to this. I think the thinking behind
Is that what you were going to say to me just then? Was that the trick question? There was no,
Right,
you know,
so
I could
there's
have kept,
actually no right or
on and on.
I think I put the question in because a lot of people are in roles where they are conflicted. Am I doing the right thing? And I think this is just to start a dialogue with regards to values. If when you've got to disconnect with your values and the company you're working with. And I do really appreciate you calling out the need for appreciating the journey as opposed to wanting the destination. Most people are so focused that I want to be this in 5 years. I don't subscribe to that because I'm also a journeyman. I've raced the
Mhm.
journey and I've found a lot and I've learned a lot about myself. And I think it's a little bit of trying to also understand what's working for people. And this is an opportunity for you to share what's working for you. You're writing it down, you're focusing on the journey, but you're still very conscious of places you'd rather work as opposed to others. If you've got, I'll call it a plethora of options of the different options in your table and you're trying to work out where you want to go. Back to my point, there's no right or wrong answer to this. It's just to get us having a dialogue on how people walk through the process of being in an organization that serves who they are and where they want to go if they have an idea of where they want to go.
Yeah, I think one thing I wanted to add there is I think you mentioned it really well. Is most people, a lot of people, not most, I think a lot of people will look and see what, where I'm from, we call it what the Joneses have. What are they doing next door? And I think I was at jujitsu the other night, and my jujitsu coach was saying, you've got to be somewhere where you're a bit inspired. You've got to get up every day with a bit of bounce to you. Don't worry that's got that. Don't worry about that. The one thing that you can control is your destiny and what you want to do. And worrying about what other people are doing. Some of the most successful people in the world have just focused on what, you take someone like Warren Buffett, for example. He is in a seriously focused world like stocks and shares. Mr. Long Term. There's no like immediate gain in that field if you're like really serious
Mhm.
about it. But people who tend to be super focused on who they are, they just seem quite content. They seem much more cooler people to hang out with at pubs and dinner parties. They're not, look at
Yeah,
me. They're the interesting people I like to chat with. They might have a job doing this, but they're really into photography or something like that. And they effectively don't give a toss whether they make any money out of it. That's their side thing. So I think I also like hanging out with people like that, to be honest with you.
good. All right, we're going to bring it to an end there. Anyone who's watching this, we've recently had a conversation in a different episode looking at learning ecosystems and learning environments. We've had Barnaby respond to some questions with regards to that. If you'd like to learn about Pako Creative, please reach out to Barnaby as well. But before we get off, a massive thank you to you for joining us today to explore learning strategies and thank you for your time again.
Pleasure.